Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. It is Tuesday, the 27th of July, 2021. I'm Luke Corbin, and today we are bringing you another seminar recorded at the Myanmar Update 2021 conference earlier this month. Today's podcast is titled The Nature, Scope and Limits of International Responses to Myanmar's Coup. And our distinguished speaker is Nicholas Coppel, now of Monash University and previously Australia's ambassador to Myanmar. Nicholas answers a couple of questions at the end of his talk, and he is introduced and convened by Mark Purcell, the CEO of the Australian Council for International Development, ACID.
Hello, my name is Mark Purcell. I'm from the Australian Council for International Development, which is the peak body for Australia's international development humanitarian NGOs, many of which are working with partners in Myanmar currently. We've got a fantastic session now looking at foreign relations, aid and the coup, a stellar panel. Nicholas Coppel, former Australian ambassador to Myanmar, now at Monash University, talking about the nature, scope and limits of international responses to Myanmar's coup. So without further ado, over to you, Nicholas.
Okay, today I will outline the nature and scope of international responses to the coup. I will also analyse the efficacy of those responses and the feasibility of the calls on the international community to save Myanmar coming from within the country. In the days following the coup, numerous statements of varying intensity were issued expressing concern, encouraging dialogue, or condemning the coup. These came from individual countries, from ASEAN as a grouping, and from various United Nations organisations. It is worth noting that these emanated not just from Western liberal democracies, and quite a number of other countries also. Turkey, for example, issued well over 4 statements since the coup. In February, the United States started to announce unilateral targeted sanctions. The Commander-in-Chief and other senior personnel and commercial entities owned or controlled by the military were targeted. The range of targets was expanded over the coming months. Canada, the UK and the EU also announced targeted sanctions, and the list of sanctioned persons and entities continues to grow. However, the number of countries sanctioning hasn't grown. The countries that are sanctioning are outliers. The vast majority of the world's nations, including all Myanmar's neighbours, have not imposed sanctions. The international financial institutions, for their part, that is the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank and the International Monetary Fund, have all expressed concern about the situation, but have not condemned the coup. The banks have placed a hold on sovereign project disbursements and new contracts. And while all these statements of concern and condemnation were being issued, the situation in Myanmar continued to deteriorate with additional arrests, the use of violence and interruptions to communications. The notion of an eventual return to democracy now seems ever more distant. If the purpose of the statements and the targeted sanctions, described by one Myanmar commentator as a watching and waiting strategy, was to put pressure on the Commander-in-Chief to reverse or to step back from the coup, then there is no sign yet of them working. This should not surprise us, as the Tatmadaw are well practiced in thriving under sanctions, ignoring international condemnation, and living in their own world. This leads me to 2 questions. First, what then is the point of the statements? Are they just symbolic? If they are ineffectual, should the world's leaders bother about them? Secondly, if statements are ignored and targeted sanctions are ineffectual, what more can the international community do to help bring about the restoration of democracy? And here, by international community, I'm talking about all countries rather than China, which I see as a special case. On the first question about the utility of statements, I would argue that they are more than symbolic, and they do serve a purpose. They are an expression of a nation's values, and they seek to articulate and put in place norms for international behaviour. Signs of support from the international community are helpful, even if the signals themselves don't bring about change. They give the people of Myanmar hope and encouragement, which helps sustain them in their struggle. Protesters in Myanmar were not so easily satisfied with mere statements of support and ineffectual sanctions. Their placards, written in English for an international audience, started to call on the world to save Myanmar, and they invoked the concept of responsibility to protect, commonly abbreviated to R2P, a concept which world leaders had agreed to in 2005. Messages on social media and placards revealed the growing frustration. This one, "Hello UN, how many dead bodies needed to take action against the military coup? Please save Myanmar." One other one read, "Just 700 people killed in 70 days. Take your time, UN. We still got millions left." Myanmar's citizenry had heard all the statements of concern and condemnation and now wanted the world to act. But R2P is not as muscular as it sounds. Its central premise is that each country must take responsibility to protect its own citizenry. It also encourages the international community to help a country that needs assistance to protect its own people. Ultimately, R2P says the international community, and I quote, has the responsibility to use appropriate diplomatic, humanitarian, and other peaceful means to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. It goes on to say, in this context, we are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council, should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations. Clearly, the primary responsibility in R2P is on the country itself to protect its own population. There is no obligation on the United Nations. There is only a statement that it is prepared as a last resort to act in certain circumstances. And then any action would be through the Security Council, where each of the 5 permanent members can exercise their power of veto. China and Russia are both P5 members and have a long record of protecting Myanmar from Security Council resolutions. As each day goes by, there is growing anxiety that the coup will become normalized and that the international community will gradually recommence dealing with the generals in Naypyidaw. This is evidenced in the calls to recognise the National Unity Government and condemnation of any contact with military council ministers or ministries as acts that legitimise the coup. Activists both inside and outside Myanmar are calling on countries, including Australia, to recognise the National Unity Government. These calls reflect a common misunderstanding. Most countries do not formally or explicitly recognise or withhold recognition of foreign governments. Instead, they recognise states, with statehood being a defined territory with a permanent population. They have this policy precisely to avoid having, after every election or coup, to convey approval or disapproval of who is in charge. It also means diplomats can engage with all parties and do so with a degree of political detachment. This is not a new approach. For instance, statements were not issued recognising the National League for Democracy after Aung San Suu Kyi's victory in 2015. You won't find any statement from Australia recognising Aung San Suu Kyi. That's, as I said, it's simply not something that gets done. So in this context, the ongoing calls to formally recognise the NUG are nugatory. However, while there aren't formal acts of recognition, governments can indicate their attitude to regimes that come to power through unconstitutional means. Indicators of attitude are found in public statements, the conduct of diplomatic relations, and the nature of and extent of contacts by ministers, officials, or defence forces. It is no secret that many countries have established contact with members of the National Unity Government. They do so to gain a more informed understanding of what's happening and what might happen next. The contacts tend to be discreet to protect the identity or location of the NUG representatives, and perhaps also not to antagonise the military. because that's not their purpose. Some will see any contact with the military council as conferring or appearing to confer legitimacy to the perpetrators of the coup. But contact, for example, to provide consular support to a detained Australian and representations that seek his release are not exercises in legitimising the coup. Such representations must be made to the party that has detained the Australian. If an Australian were held hostage by a People's Defence Force, then the contact to secure release would not be with the Military Council, but with the NUG. And contact that is motivated by a desire to gain acceptance for facilitated mediation should not be ruled out. Similarly, if there is a need to deliver international humanitarian assistance in central Myanmar, well beyond the communities on the Thai border, there will need to be contact with the Military Council. These forms of contact are very different in nature and purpose from the contact that Russia and China have had with the coup leader Min Aung Hlaing and other members of the Military Council, which clearly indicate an acceptance of the coup and an indifference to the wishes of the people. Contact, then, should be judged by its intent and not ruled out absolutely. To put it another way, there is more to diplomacy than the exercise of cancel culture at a governmental level. China is a special case. It does have levers to put pressure on Myanmar's military. Its support for a range of armed groups within Myanmar, its sale of military hardware, and the protection it provides to Myanmar and the Security Council are all levers. But China has no history of active diplomacy in the pursuit of regional or international security. Unless there is a direct threat to China or China's interests, China will not act. They call it non-interference. It could also be called indifference. I have spoken about the nature, scope, and limits of responses by foreign governments to Myanmar's coup, but there are other parties that have agency, and I will now consider their responses. The United Nations and its numerous specialised agencies do not have the option of sidestepping the question of who represents Myanmar. By their very nature, international organisations are a collection of government representatives. Here I'm talking about representation, not membership, which is recognition of the state. Representation is about the individual delegate representing the member state. The United Nations was presented with this dilemma when Myanmar's permanent representative to the UN, Chor Tun, told the General Assembly that he would remain loyal to the democratically elected government. The next day, Myanmar's Military Council dismissed him and advised the UN that his deputy would become acting ambassador in his place. Chor Tun then wrote to the UN Secretary General to advise that he remained Myanmar's ambassador to the UN. Questions of representation are considered by the United Nations 9-member Credentials Committee. China, Russia, and the US are usually on this committee. The committee will report to the General Assembly later this year, and the General Assembly will then vote to accept or reject the committee's recommendations. Historical precedent does not give us a clear indication of what will be recommended. The rules of the Credentials Committee are silent on situations where representation is contested. In the early days of the UN, and in the absence of rules, the committee looked at which claimant was in a position to fulfil the obligations of membership. That is, which claimant had effective control of the state. However, in the 1990s, the Credentials Committee on 5 occasions rejected the credentials of delegations from governments that did have effective control, but had come to power through unconstitutional means. In these cases, the UN had invested heavily in bringing peace and democratic elections to a country. Of course, the underlying principle of the UN is universality, and democracy is not a requirement for membership. The reality is that the Charter of the UN is silent on governments that have come to power through unconstitutional means, and there are no legal rules governing competing claims to representation. Ultimately, it will be the views of the major powers who are members of the Credentials Committee which will decide which claimant represents Myanmar, although it is also possible for the committee to not accredit either claimant or to defer consideration of the matter, effectively leaving Myanmar's seat vacant. Other UN agencies generally follow the decision of the General Assembly. I've spoken about possible responses by governments and international organisations, and I will now briefly mention responses by the international business community. We can get a sense of these from the 19 February statement issued by the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. It said they watched developments with deep concern, but did not expressly condemn the coup or even use the word coup. They said safety of their employees was their number one concern, while continuing to provide essential services to the people of Myanmar. They hoped for a swift resolution of the situation based on dialogue and reconciliation. Essentially, it was a message to the rest of the world, rather than to the military council or to the people of Myanmar. And the message was, our ongoing operations are a force for good, so don't target us with sanctions. 4 months after the coup, the Institute for Human Rights and Business, which is the parent body of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business, advised all companies continuing to operate in Myanmar to, quote, take even more rigorous actions to ensure they do everything in their power to abide by international standards and avoid complicity in human rights violations. It went on to say that all businesses need to avoid and end commercial relationships, direct or indirect, with the military and its economic interests. This statement came after several large multinationals, notably Kirin Holdings Company and POSCO Coated and Colour Steel, had announced that they were ending joint ventures with military conglomerates. You'll note that both these companies are from countries that traditionally do not impose unilateral sanctions. Multinational corporations taking it upon themselves to cut ties with the military and their commercial entities is an interesting development. In the absence of mandated sanctions, we are seeing some companies deciding for themselves that they should not be doing business in a military-controlled business environment. Most recently, the Telenor Group, which does not have ties to the military but is required to follow increasingly unpalatable directives from the Military Council, has chosen to divest. There's no doubt that the deteriorating business environment has contributed to a review of operations, but we should also not underestimate the desire to avoid reputational damage and the role that large ethical fund managers play in the decisions of major publicly listed companies. It is tempting to see the withdrawal of multinationals as another blow to the junta. They are that, but they are also a blow to Myanmar's workers, many of whom are women working in clothing and footwear factories. Later in this session, Sarah Toad will talk about her research on fashion workers in Myanmar. So far, nothing seems to be working. Those in Myanmar opposed to the coup have tried peaceful means of protest. They have tried civil disobedience. They have tried reclaiming the streets. And now they're trying to take on the security apparatus directly. They have tried appealing to the international community, which has issued and continues to issue numerous statements of condemnation. They have tried appealing to the UN to intervene and to save Myanmar. Now, aware of the flaccidity of international action, the National Unity Government no longer looks to the international community to resolve Myanmar's problems. Their position has hardened, and they reject dialogue with the Military Council and reject ASEAN efforts to encourage reconciliation. So where does this leave the international community? Is there more that it can do? The international community can continue to condemn, and there is scope for more individuals and military entities to be sanctioned by more countries. And I'll wrap up very shortly. And there is a purpose to such actions beyond the feeling of doing good, but we need to be clear-eyed that they won't bring about regime change. The United Nations will always be constrained by the need for P5 consensus, and Myanmar has a long history of denying any role for international mediation in its domestic conflicts. But it is in the area of mediation that the international community could play a useful role, if only there was a will on both sides for a negotiated settlement. In the absence of that willingness, the efforts of the UN Special Envoy, the ASEAN Special Envoy, or any other envoy that might come along, will be unlikely to bear fruit. However, at this stage, it is important for both the Military Council and the NUG to know that the international community is willing to facilitate mediation. The ASEAN 5-point consensus doesn't have buy-in from the NUG, and there's been no substantive progress on implementation in the 2.5 months since it was issued. Flawed though it is, we should not abandon support for ASEAN-facilitated mediation, because 6 months after the coup, it remains the only opening. It is ultimately for the people of Myanmar and for their elected representatives to decide how best to take forward their struggle. The international community has a role to play, but it's not a decisive one. And in my view, the focus of the international community should now be on seeking to grow the opportunities for the parties to reach a new, mutually acceptable agreement. I'm not naive and accept that the chances of this effort bearing fruit are very slim indeed. But short of military intervention, which won't happen, nothing else that the international community, other than China, can do has a chance either. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for that very elegant and cogent analysis. We have a few minutes for questions. What do you think of the NUG stand on non-negotiation with the SAC, and what will it lead to? Nicholas.
Essentially, a statement that the NUG is not willing to negotiate is a statement that they are going to achieve their means solely through violence and the use of force. But, ultimately, even if they were to be successful in such an endeavour, ultimately, Myanmar will have an armed forces of some sort, and there has to be some negotiation or discussion along that. I think it would probably be more useful for NUG to have a clear idea of what it is that what they want, and how far should their demands go. Is it a new constitution? Is it simply the restoration of democracy, a new system, a new federal system, and so on? But to rule out negotiation, absolutely, I think is it cuts out the potential for a peaceful resolution. Not that there is much prospect for that at the moment, but to just rule it out is not something I would suggest is a welcome development.
Thank you, Nicholas. A question for you just regarding wider foreign institutions' push for sanctions, and then I'd like an additional question there about the case of Libya and Cambodia around control or lack of control of state territory, and does that have any bearing on the current situation recognition of the SAC and Myanmar?
All right. With sanctions, unless they're mandated UN sanctions, I think the history shows that they're not very effective in putting pressure on Myanmar's regime, and even if it's a small group of Western countries, it's most of Myanmar's trade is not with them. It's with neighbouring countries, in particular with China. It's interesting that that this time round there's been. There haven't been the calls for general sanctions, for widespread sanctions in Myanmar, but only for targeted ones. And I think that reflects a growing appreciation of how sanctions can affect the livelihoods of ordinary people more than the elite who find ways around them. And the question of Libya, Libya, I think it's referring to 2011 when the United Nations Credentials Committee decided to recognise that the National Transitional Council would represent Libya rather than Gaddafi. In the case of Cambodia in the 1980s, that was indeed the time when Australia and many other countries changed their policies from recognising governments to only recognising states. And one of the reasons for doing that is there were multiple parties contesting and claiming to be the authority for Cambodia, and the need to be engaged with all of them as part of the way of finding a pathway forward was necessary. So it's each situation is very different, and I guess what I'm saying in relation to Myanmar today is the act of recognition is no longer one of a government, is no longer one which is employed. And one of the reasons for that is so that you can engage in consultations and dialogue with all the parties. And it's only by doing that is there a chance where you can help to, facilitate some sort of negotiated outcome.
Thanks so much, Nicholas.